This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod.
And we are back in the dark room. For people who don't know, a dark room is when we revisit a subject in which we've done the core episode on, and we bring in somebody who knows that subject a little bit better, a little bit differently, both sometimes. And we, there's a little bit of a pun there. We kind of further develop our ideas in the dark room. So today we have the great Matthew Pegas. He is, as you probably know, if you're listening to this, he's one half of the podcast New Right. He's the author of 2 books, Dragon Days, and the recently released The Black Album, which we want to talk about a little bit. Right. He's as well as a prolific essayist on a wide range of topics. He's also the host of Strange Flows, podcast about the creative process, spirituality, and esotericism.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Matthew. For people who enjoy this conversation, Matthew's also joined us for 2 previous Darkroom conversations on Aleister Crowley and William S. Burroughs. Today, we're talking about David Foster Wallace. This is a fan favorite. Anytime we drop David Foster Wallace content, it's just so. That's always cool. So, Matthew, first of all, how you doing?
Doing well. Thank you for having me on this lovely Saturday morning. And it's thank you for that intro.
Yeah.
My brand continues to evolve, with a new book out, and I am half of New Right, and that's not changing anytime soon. But I feel like I've been building out my own podcast a bit, which is pretty relevant, which is maybe even more relevant to, for example, the Black Album. So very, very appreciated the very detailed intro, but I'm also really happy and excited to be back here for round 3 in the dark room. Not sure, not that I even care if there's any records. I don't know, like who's been on the dark rooms the most. It's probably not me, but
3 is up there. Probably our most common guests have been, at this point, would be you, Aldous Asterian, and Aaron Gwynn. I want to say probably on here the most. So definitely up there. Yeah.
No, and I have to say, like, I always enjoy coming on, and whenever I am coming on in this podcast in particular, it doesn't so much feel like I'm like a guest. It's although of course I am a guest to you and Kevin, no doubt. I'm not assuming any higher level of power than I have, but I have to say, whenever I sort of pick a topic and then bring it to you guys, it's always like very, very personal to me. Like, I'm never just like, oh, time to go on, Brad and Kevin's podcast again. And, in this case, obviously, like, I'm glad to be able to promote my book, but that's 100% not why I'm here. It's more like I actually heard it like a year later, your David Foster Wallace episode. For some reason, I missed it, and I only heard it a couple months ago, and it was immediately like, I have all these thoughts on David Foster Wallace. I need to get them out, and I have a platform to talk to 2 really smart guys about it. And as
I'll tell you what your status is on the podcast. It's really you're friend of the pod.
Friend of the pod.
Absolutely.
Friend of the pod. Just like Burroughs, every subject we cover is friend of the pod. You just happen to be alive for now.
For now. Indeed.
Well, let's start by talking about the Black Album a little bit, because you gave me the opportunity to read it before it was out, and I was very excited about it.
Blurb for it, which I
appreciate. Well, that's great, and if that seals the deal for anybody, that's awesome. But let me just say, I recommend it. Definitely check it out, especially if you vibe with what Matt's up to. But sell it for us a little bit.
Yeah, so this is a collection of short stories and essays that I've written. The short stories are mostly written in kind of one period of about 6 months. The essays reach back a little bit. The oldest one I think is from 2020. The most recent one is from I think most of the essays that ended up in it are all from the end of 2022. So I have new work in the works as well, but this sort of encapsulates a certain time in my life, I guess you could say. And even though it's short stories and essays mixed, I've been getting a lot of good feedback, and I myself would stand behind this. You know, that they're all kind of thematically related. Brad, your blurb sums it up pretty well. There's kind of a sort of alchemical or esoteric through line for sure. The stories are kind of in a H.P. Lovecraft or Thomas Ligotti vein. Not that I'm really aping either of those styles because I couldn't, but it's kind of like my own sort of psychological realist type of writing that I do, filtered through a what's the word other than Lovecraftian? I don't know. I think Lovecraftian is the word. That sort of horror. And the essays are sort of commenting on that from another side. Not sure if I'm doing a fantastic job of selling this. I almost just want to pull up your blurb.
Oh boy.
Which I won't make you guys sit here while I pull up the blurb. But
no. We could do that. I've got it right. I've got it right here. I have the handsome
Yeah.
hardcover edition, which I think, oops, I had it the wrong way there for the YouTubers. Putting it in hardcover is interesting, man. It's beautiful. It makes it more of an object somehow, right?
Oh, yeah, completely.
Yeah, and the design of it, it feels full of esoteric power just holding it. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
We were talking off the air about how kind of satisfied I've been with Amazon KDP. Not to necessarily vouch for a mega corporation, but I have to say it's a pretty streamlined process. And I wasn't even planning on doing a hardcover. But I think it's a more recent thing that Amazon KDP has really streamlined that. And yeah, I'm just one or two test copies, a couple of tweaks, and it came out really well. It came out much better than I thought it would have. I was kind of dreading the whole process. I was like, I don't really have this very technical oriented skill set, but Amazon does a pretty good job. Because I'd helped a friend, Robert Stark, who I don't think he's been on this podcast, but people know who he is, through Lulu Publishing, and that was a nightmare. I mean, not to diss Lulu. I think if you have more technical prowess, like Lulu is fine. But for me, not having the technical prowess, I was pretty lost. But Amazon KDP makes it pretty straightforward. And yeah, I think the physical object that came out, I'm immensely satisfied with. I think it has a cover that raises a lot of eyebrows. It does sort of look like a what's the word? Not a Necronomicon esque book, or a what's the word for like a spell book?
Necronomicon, a grimoire.
A grimoire. That's what it's not a grimoire. I'm not necessarily as I've given. I think when we did our Crowley episode and even our Burroughs episode, a lot of the episodes we've done have touched on this theme, and I think even this one will a little bit. We'll see. I'm not necessarily endorsing any kind of extreme occultist direction. I recognize these ideas are not for everyone. But in terms of the book itself, it's a little darker and scarier than maybe the book is. I'm just trying to make an intriguing object.
Well,
and I think it came out that way. I'm quite satisfied.
You certainly did. I mean, I can read this blurb if you want.
I feel like a dork making you do it, but since we set it up, go ahead.
Why not? Okay. Matthew Pegas is figuring out how to live in a world which seems increasingly uninhabitable. The Black Album is a work of compelling modern alchemy. Its materia, the internet and manhood, the body, the occult, the darkness. And from this, he has made just enough light to see the way. And, that's my attempt to get that, what I think is going on in this book in as few words as possible, but obviously it doesn't do it justice.
Brad, you should try to be a writer. That was a very good blurb. That was a strong, very strong.
Turns out there's no money in it, Kevin.
Brad is available for blurbs almost universally.
What?
All right. Where can
I gotta like both the book and the person. So
understood.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess kind of one thing I want to sort of ask you, and we'll kind of lead into our David Foster Wallace conversation this way. You had sent a kind of work in progress essay on David Foster Wallace, but maybe we can start with this. What is his influence on you as a writer, and do you think it shows up in this book or not? Or tell us about that.
So I think that he's probably influenced me more than anybody else, and from an early age in a way that makes it almost hard for me to detect where he is influencing me. Um, so to answer sort of the last part of your question first, I think yes, he looms over the Black Album in the sense that but maybe a little more over Dragon Day. And really what I mean by that is that I think he's influenced everything I've ever written and sort of my desire to write in the first place. More so than a direct stylistic influence. In the case of the Black Album, in the case of Dragon Day, which not even to get too far into that, I think there's a little bit more of a direct exploration of self-conscious, like painful self-consciousness within that. His influence on me. So I I was not like a precocious reader or anything as a kid. I actually sort of eschewed it for many years. I had an older sister who was a much more voracious reader. Like so I wasn't the kid reading like all Lord of the Rings and all that when I was like 9 or 10. So really one of the first writers that I really heavily got into in a way that like this is mine. It wasn't until I was like 15 or 16 and it was David Foster Wallace.
Wow.
And it started in the most pretentious manner possible that I'm both ashamed of this, but also I think it's illuminating sort of for who David Foster, not so much who David Foster Wallace is, but sort of what he's become. And I'll add the caveat from the get-go. Like I'm a firm believer that pretension, I think there's James Murphy from LCD Sound System has some kind of quote where he's like, pretension isn't bad. Like pretension is often how you get into things that you later genuinely like. You know what I mean? Like you start by trying to be cool and then you discover, the best music, the best literature, and your relationship with it becomes much more authentic. That was certainly the case for me with David Foster Wallace.
Yeah.
Some may enjoy this factoid. I literally found Wallace because I Googled. I was suburban striver. I was homeschooled, which comes up in the Black Album. So maybe that's a little bit of an excuse for why I was Googling something this cringe or like being this much of a try hard because I was just trying to, as suburban kids do, trying to find some kind of, I guess, identity. And I was interested in hipsterdom, in like 2010. I was like, 15, 16. And I literally Googled books that hipsters read. And David Foster Wallace was the first thing that came up.
Yeah.
And I was like, all right, this guy looks okay. I saw that he'd killed himself. That didn't really perturb me, but I wasn't like, oh, this guy killed himself. He must have. It was more just like, oh, that's kind of sad. I guess, but I guess this guy's cool or whatever. And I ordered his book Oblivion from the library, which is still easily his best, if not one of his best, or one of his best, if not the best short story collection from DFW, in my opinion, especially the story Good Old Neon.
Yeah, Good Old Neon,
which is kind of the holy grail of his short stories, kind of really delving into his suicidal narcissistic mindset. And then to make a long story shorter, I'll get to the sort of, I mean, I could go on and on about Wallace and how he's influenced me at different stages, but even though it started off, by the time I was done with Oblivion, just a short while later, and it's particularly after reading Good Old Neon, it was almost uncanny that I kind of found him in such a stupid way, and that his work spoke to me so immediately. Because at the time, and again, this does relate a little bit to the Black Album, where I talk a bit, not in an emo weepy way, but just in a more of a, I guess, an origin story way about some of my own teenage neuroses. And I sort of, for some reason, I won't even, it's not going to turn this into therapy hour, but for some reason as a teenager, I was like convinced that, and maybe this is just a writerly thing in a way, like I was convinced that I had some sort of weird, and I guess I probably did, as many teenagers do, but I was like convinced this was going to like ruin my life in the way that it kind of maybe did ruin David Foster Wallace's life. I don't know. Like I just had this sense that like, oh man, I'm so in my own head. Like I can never really be like a normal. I don't know. I won't even get into it. It was largely a teenage thing that, unlike Wallace, which got worse with age. I think I've gotten a lot better in that regard. But anyway, Good Old Neon was like, it's literally me. It's speaking to my soul vibes. And then I read Infinite Jest, and then I read The Pale Cane. These are long books, and I wasn't the biggest reader beforehand, but really, like, he just was the first writer that I got into in this way. Yeah. And it became really uncool to like David Foster Wallace around the time I was in college. Maybe we can unpack that a little more, but it became, Bret Easton Ellis wrote like a pretty good takedown of the end of the Tor movie, and kind of by extension took down Wallace. And I was incensed at first. Then I was like, hey, maybe this guy has some points. Got really into Ellis later. That was a whole dialectical thing for me. And I will say, reading Bret Easton Ellis as someone who was critiquing David Foster Wallace probably made me a better writer, because aping Wallace is not a good idea.
No.
Aping Ellis is a slightly better idea, or at least it kind of liberated. That's a side quest.
Yeah,
but,
no, but I take your meaning. I mean, there's David Foster Wallace. You try to relate like David Foster Wallace, and it looks like you're trying to write like David Foster Wallace. Bret Easton Ellis's style, and this is no disparagement to him whatsoever. Bret Easton Ellis's style, to my reading, is not as does not draw attention to itself in the same manner that David Foster Wallace's does. He's an amazing writer.
Yeah, it's,
but it's just
cinematic quality, which is more transferable. I don't think my work's that much like Brett's either, but it's more like Brett's than DFW, and it just that's a better starting point. But anyway, to finish the story, so I became uncool, and then of course there's the kind of more feminist pre-Me Too, pre-Trump backlash that made it like really uncool.
Right.
So I sort of stepped away from DFW, and then like in sort of right of center, or just whatever this Twitter space that we're all in and out of, it's not especially cool like David Foster Wallace within that either. So it's really up until, I would never have said he wasn't a good writer, that he wasn't hugely influential on me, but it really wasn't until this past year that I actually really read David Foster Wallace again. And it was like that feeling of, I don't want to be too corny, but like, like jumping into a warm bath, like a homecoming. Because it was like, not that I lost track of this, but it's very much like, oh, this was what, this is what I first got into. And like, yes, there's some valid criticisms of Wallace, but also like, even just like some of the values, both writerly values and sort of the ethical thrust of especially his later writing. I just never underestimate how much that has informed my worldview.
Right on. One of the things about the sort of criticisms, and this is probably speaking to you broadly, but one of the things about the criticisms of David Foster Wallace that I came to see more clearly when we did our core episode, and I hadn't read any David Foster Wallace in years at that point. I just knew he was somebody we wanted covered, and he'd been significant in my readership and development as a writer. But one of the faults in the criticism I've realized is there's a lot of associating David Foster Wallace with the things he was trying to sincerely criticize himself.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sort of all this David Foster Wallace it's kind of like ironic, up its own ass, put upon intellectualism. And like David Foster Wallace is trying to say like, yeah, that's who I am, and I'm like trying to figure my way through it. It was like, and it turned out to me, and my kind of take on this aspect of it now is like David Foster Wallace's perspective and how he was approaching the same things that he was being criticized for doing was actually more sophisticated than the criticism of him in a lot of ways. And that doesn't put him on a pedestal that means he's unassailable in any way. But I just think that, as is often the case, the criticism is actually aimed at a very low resolution version of the person being criticized. Right? It's very sort of two-dimensional. We're gonna make an 8-bit version of David Foster Wallace, and we're gonna attack that. And meanwhile, he is one of the great talents, and maybe his Infinite Jest isn't your favorite. Maybe you think it's a failed project, and that's one thing. But you can't totally dismiss him. So, yeah.
No, I very much agree. I think it is what it is, as you said. A lot of people, and in that beginning of an essay that I shared with you, just because I thought there could be some relevant tidbits to what I want to talk about today, and I hope to later have this later have this full essay on Wallace out, because I do have a lot of thoughts, and anyway, where was I going with that? I think it's both. It's really unfortunate that, Wallace in a way did it to himself. I'm not trying to pedestalize him or say he's the victim of all this, whatever, but a writer who is like, I expect the question of, what does reading this David Foster Wallace book say about me? Like, I think he'd be really disgusted to know that that's what we all think about when we pick up his books. I think he was going for the exact opposite of that. But by cultivating I mean, I think a lot of elements of his style with the long sentences, with the footnotes, with the paralysis by analysis. I think all of that, there was some cheekiness to it at times. He is certainly, even though he was reacting against postmodernism later, he's certainly cut from the cloth of postmodernism. Kind of for me, what I'm saying about Wallace's influence over my like work and writing is pretty much probably what he would say about, Pynchon and DeLille. Like he is a postmodernist, even if later became a postmodernist. But anyhow, there is something cheeky about a lot of the writing. I'm not saying David Foster Wallace was immune from, I'm sure he was writing at times, as sort of initially, especially, writing to be impressive in a way that's doubtlessly true. And yet I think especially later, he was the what even is the word, the logorrhea of his prose, I do think was an attempt to get at something truthful about reality that he couldn't find. And, he was trying, the cause of his very distinctive style, I do think was trying to hone in on this thing. But by doing that, by trying to so hard to encourage sincere engagement, he created a style that kind of invites everything except sincere engagement. For me, it's like put. Books that hipsters read, it attracts a certain pretension. And then for a lot of other people, it's eye roll inducing. And I think the real engagement with Wallace can be kind of hard to find. The other thing I'll say, not to go on and on here, but the other thing I'll say is, in addition to the Wallace that gets criticized being a 2-bit version of Wallace, I think the Wallace that was briefly extolled, and this is what Bret Easton Ellis in that The End of the Tour piece I was talking about was really reacting against, much more so than Wallace himself. I kind of like that movie, The End of the Tour. We can touch on it later. I don't know, but it does really that, and then it's just in the water of the culture of like 2013 to 2015 in general, really just portraying him as this tortured genius, like who was able to prescribe or diagnose rather a lot of the issues with modernity, and even try to prescribe these solutions, but he just wasn't. There's this Kurt Cobain-esque thing where it's like he just wasn't quite. He was a little too sensitive, and he, is this tragic victim of mental health issues, which is all true to an extent. But what I'm trying to say is there was a 2-bit version of Wallace that got extolled as well, and that was a sort of soft, doughy, nice guy Wallace.
Right. Right.
And like I'll stand by this. Like, this is water. His speech for Kenyon. Bret Easton Ellis in that End of the Tour piece is like it's terrible, but Bret Easton Ellis is very disgruntled. I like This Is Water a lot. Like, I think it's lovely. It's beautiful. It's just that that's not the be all end all of what Wallace was.
Right. And I think partially some of the kind of the criticism of the This Is Water speech kind of comes across. It's because it is open to sort of, if you're irony poisoned, the This Is Water speech is vulnerable to aesthetic criticism of like, well, that seems like something somebody would put on their Pinterest board, right? It's kind of cheesy, like, oh, but then when you dive into it, he really does crystallize some of the sort of pain of modern life, and I know we're gonna talk about this, the just flat out boredom of and tedium of just being a modern human being, and you gotta do I spent. I was thinking about this just the other day because I was thinking about this conversation, and I have a part of my normal daily routine is a pretty long drive. And for various reasons, it ended up about twice as long. Yeah. And I just had this moment where I'm sitting here and I'm like, this is how life is. Somebody has a fender bender, and suddenly my entire day is, suddenly an hour of my day, which is already very difficult to navigate time-wise, is just gone. And parts of you want to scream out the window, right? And parts you want to like you feel all these kinds of different reactions come up, and they're all kind of justifiable, but really, like, the only way you're going to get through it is if you try to find some space in there to accommodate yourself or something. And for all the for how hugely talented Bret Easton Ellis is, American Psycho doesn't help me sit in that traffic jam, and This Is Water does. So So there's a lot of reasons to write a book or write anything, but I think that was, and you also have to think of the context he gave that speech, and he was talking. It was a graduation speech, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't like, here's my finished novel. It has a very specific audience, and the points of those speeches are very. It's a very direct point that you're trying to make with those
Yeah, no, it basically it should be almost Pinterest board worthy. I
Right.
mean, that's kind of the medium, and I think he
Mhm.
understood that. And I do think it's deceptively. I do think he gets into some more profound stuff within This Is Water.
Mhm.
Part of one of the things that got me back into David Foster Wallace that I want to talk about is this section of the Pale King called Something to Do with Paying Attention, which is the longest chapter on its own, I think, or one of the longest chapters
Mhm.
within the Pale King. And it was recontextualized this, I didn't know anything about this. I think I was on David Foster Wallace's Wikipedia, and I was like, what is this newly published
Right.
novella? Which of course I'd already read, back in high school as part of the Pale King, but it's republished in 2022. It's McNally Editions, I think, is the
Mhm.
republication agent or
Mhm.
publishing company. And it's the quote on the back of that novella is like it's one of the best places to start with David Foster Wallace and one of the best places to jump back in. I completely agree with that. It was a very, very suitable place for me to jump back in. And it kind of gets to the heart of some of these issues with boredom and paying attention that I know we want to talk about.
Mhm.
But the reason I bring this up is because as I think it's a really good piece of fiction. It's kind of funny,
Mhm.
while also being really moving and just kind of philosophically like some of the sharpest, clearest stuff. And by philosophically, I mean like, I don't mean his lapses into like weird mathematic stuff. I mean
Right.
like the David Foster Wallace worldview is laid out really well.
Right. Like actual,
Real-
like practical, like I was going to use the word stoicism, but not quite that. Like literally, like how can you get through your life
like a
kind of stuff.
modern how can you get through your life kind of stuff, and in a way from someone who, let's face it, was really fucking smart, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
So I don't know if you guys swear on this pod or
Yeah,
not, I don't
you're
remember.
good.
Okay.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, we
like
fucking do. Let me interject just real quick and just say, as I'm listening to this, because I'm the one who doesn't write prose
Mhm.
generally, I'm thinking about the Gen X question and
mm,
how, and I'm a big not all boomers guy, and yet we can speak in generalities. And the BQ, the
Mhm.
boomer
yes.
question, haunts all of us. And of course, DFW is like the avatar, like the tulpa of Gen X
Mhm.
in a
Hmm.
way,
Yes.
literary Gen X. There are very few others who are kind of that.
Mhm.
And one has to wonder if Gen X will ever see power. Will
Eh,
and you know, we struggle as millennials relating to the boomers, and of course they feel the same way. It's mutual. And again, not all boomers. I know we have boomers who listen to the show, and I'm not trying to speak ill of, be too categorical, but we have to
Mhm.
sort of find a way to have a conversation about this. And uh I think about the long shadow of the boomer and how it's cast over us millennials. I can only imagine what it must be like for Gen X. So I'm just going to throw that into the conversation. And Matthew, I'm sorry I
No,
interjected.
it's
I
okay.
I lived
Yeah.
in New York for 7 years, so
Yeah.
sometimes I interrupt. I learned how to interrupt there
No,
there.
it's good.
But yes,
Yeah.
yeah. So I'm just throwing that into the conversation. That's
No,
where
I
my mind.
think, well, and I think it actually, I hadn't really thought about this and articulated it to myself, but this uh novella, this part of the Pale King that Matthew's talking about, it actually is in some ways about the boomer and the
It
Gen
is.
X. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because the main character is it Dave Wallace is the name of the
I
character?
actually don't think it is. I don't think
Yeah.
he's named in
No,
the
Dave Wallace is
novella at all.
another character in the Pale King, I think.
That's right. Yeah, it's
Right.
I think that the guy does have a name, but it's not brought up in that section, so I don't
Yeah.
remember it. It's a
Right.
generic
Yeah,
like
so
white
it,
guy
it
name.
doesn't really matter, but I mean, a lot of it is about how, in some ways, he's at least at the start of it is um, has all of the qualities that one might associate with Generation X, and a lot of it is about his relationship to not only his father, who is you just assume is a boomer, but is not only about his father, but also about the competing perspectives of those two
Oh
two
yeah.
generations, right? His dad is a boomer's boomer, and he's a Gen Xer's Gen Xer.
Or, and not to split hairs over this, but
Mhm.
is the because it's set in the late 70s, early 80s. I think
Oh, could be a boomer.
maybe the main character is a younger boomer like David Foster Wallace
Which David Foster
himself,
Wallace was. Yeah.
and maybe the father is actually more silent gen,
You could be right.
as it were,
Yeah.
or not
Yeah.
sound or greatest gen, whatever the fuck they call it.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah, not
Yeah,
to
whatever.
Not on this podcast.
What,
Not on
the greatest
no, we
generation,
don't.
it's whatever
No.
one we're in, guys. That's the best
Correct.
one.
correct,
Yeah,
correct.
that's
Whatever you
right.
call that gen,
That's
race.
right. Yeah, we don't
Um,
call them. Yeah.
But
No.
hey, yeah, like I think it is definitely engaged with yeah, it's hard to know exact, there's I think, yeah, you're definitely dealing with someone who is like Wallace himself, is bridging the gap between boomerdom and Gen Xdom. Like the boomer proclivities towards new ways of thinking and drug use combined with a more Gen X whatever man attitude is that sorry, I got distracted.
That's all right.
To turn text off of my computer.
Yeah.
Yeah, bridging that gap between Gen Boomer and Gen X is, I think, kind of the specific cultural moment that the main character of that story finds himself in. And I think the main reason I feel the need to be like actually about this is because I think that the dad character is kind of very much not a boomer. He's
Okay.
regardless of whether or not that's the greatest gen, he's someone who lived this more straightforward life, so to speak.
Yeah. No, I guess you're right.
Some of the quotes are like men from his generation, didn't think much about like who they should marry. They kind of just like got hitched at 22, and he's this guy. It's almost. We'll get into the details of the book, but it's almost humorously rendered. Like I do think Wallace is extolling this guy as like a product of a higher trust society that like we would be better off in. Like the dad character is the moral center of the book in many ways, but he also makes fun of him a bit. There's no doubt about in this novella. Like he talks about him having a shoe tree.
Yeah.
And like just like going red in the face and like having like special headphones to listen to classical music and drinking 2 beers a week and this kind of it's like all good habits of like a functioning adult. But there's no doubt in my mind that Wallace kind of found the humor in the guy as well. So it's not always crystal clear. He's definitely not extolling his boomer Gen X hybrid protagonist who does some things. He's self-described wastoid.
Yeah.
It's a moral redemption narrative that starts with the worst proclivities of those generations, and he is definitely praising the older generation as well. But I can't. I mean, it's really also just quite funny, as I guess what I'm trying to say, which is a little bit beside the point. But yeah, basically, it's this generational clash between not even to split hairs over who's what, but yeah, an older generation, pre-60s generation versus post-60 generation. I think that's the clearest way to put it. With both boomers are sort of like peak 60s, Gen X is kind of post 60s, and some people fall sort of in the middle of that. And
can we maybe just for a second, can we give like a real brief overview of this novella? I don't know if that's, I don't want to put you in the hot seat on that, but
no, sure. Yeah. It's described as like one of the strangest conversion narratives in modern literature, which I think is exactly what it's structured, just like a Christian sort of like apologist, like a Road to Damascus sort of story about, again, this boomer Gen X middle ground type of dude who's living in Chicagoland and studying humanities subjects in school. He keeps sort of dropping in and out of college, not taking it too seriously. He lives with his father, who is, who we've talked about the father, who's from a different generation, is encouraging him to,
and his
make
father,
something
like,
more of his life.
His father has like a very regular job in public service of some kind.
Yeah, public service that he takes very seriously. Not even to get into all the details, but he's divorced from his wife because his wife has this foray into lesbianism that she later regrets. That's so. Yeah, again, maybe they, maybe his wife.
Maybe his wife's the boomer, and
maybe his wife's the spiritual boomer. Regardless of these as with any generational trends, you have some old people who are like older people who try to graft onto the trends, and some we're all over the map here, but
Yeah.
yeah. So he's this very much this product of the '60s and '70s, and he describes himself as a wastoid. He's addicted to, well, he's not like it's not like a William S. Burroughs like drug addiction story. He just kind of takes any drugs that are there, weed, different amphetamines, which later become important. He's not like a drug addict. He's more just like a general drug user. And again, yeah, self-described wastoid. Spends days watching TV, whatever, not taking school seriously. And it's all just a first person recounting. You kind of realize this, I guess, even just a few pages in, that this is supposed to be, because The Pale King, the novel, is all about people who work for the IRS, as is well known for people who know Wallace. And so this is like an interview with the character going into how he ended up at the IRS. Like, that's how it's all structured, as a first person. Like a lot of Wallace stories are like this. Like, it's someone talking. That's kind of what this story is. And he's recounting, in a long-winded way that only David Foster Wallace himself would ever probably recount a story. Everything that happened. And I just absolutely love it. I don't know if it's for everyone, but for me, it's like this slow build of, he's a wastoid. We can get into some of the details later. He later has this kind of enlightening experience on amphetamines, of all things, that like kind of, not that Wallace or the character in this book encourages drug use, but it's almost like the use of this amphetamine sort of cuts through all the fog of that era. That's a recurring image in the story, is like there was just a foggy era where everything was morally gray. There was no sense of any, like, a malaise. And somehow using this amphetamine, like, actually sort of is like an early awakening for him of realizing, like, oh, there's actually great power in like being really precise and paying attention in the way that his father kind of was about everything in his life. All this culminates, a lot of things happen in the story. The father dies in a freak way. I'm not trying to spoil it or anything. But it's not really that kind of story.
I hate to, a part of it that I think is brilliant, and yet I wouldn't even say necessarily read it for this section, but it's brilliant in a David Foster Wallace kind of way. His father is killed in like an semi-ironic accident on the L train, and or the train or whatever in Chicago.
In Chicago, huh?
And the narrative then goes on to like explain the outfall, and it's just this like bureaucratic nightmare of like everybody's trying to shunt blame off to everybody else, and then like it finally, like, if I remember right, it finally ends in like some small settlement. But like, I remember reading that part and just being like, yeah, that's kind of what it is to be modern in modern life. You have this dramatic, emotional, almost poetic in a dark way moment in your life, and it just gets kind of like squared off and fades into just bureaucratic nothingness. Right?
Absolutely.
It kind of gets taken from you.
This is precisely what they do with childbirth in America as well. We just had a baby.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, baby boy, healthy baby boy.
Excellent.
And they wouldn't. I had a certain ID. They wouldn't accept it. And there's some monstrous, bureaucratic now the birth record is a certain way, and then now we got to go back to the hospital and we got to go do this, and then if that doesn't happen, then we don't get health insurance, and then we got to think about the health insurance, and then we got to go do the birth certificate, and then we got to do it's this again, Kafka was a hack. I mean, Kafka wouldn't last 10 days at a strip mall Chipotle in America. He'd blow his brains out. Totally insane. Totally.
No, and Kafka. Right. Go on. Sorry.
No, not at all. So they take this most beautiful, most holy, most sacred thing, literally plucking consciousness out of the void in God's image, this beautiful baby, and then they shove paperwork at you as parents, and then they make it. Then it's going to cost you, and whatever. Children are not that expensive. Don't believe that lie. Right. However, you're gonna
go all through all these things, but it's still
hoop, and it's the last thing that you want to do after having a baby. All you want to do is go home and just enjoy the glow of the baby, be around family. But no, you've got form.
Exactly. Right. And I think in this this long chapter, this novella. That's one of the things that Wallace, I think, really nails is, and it's entangled with this concept of boredom in a way, right? It's though that's almost like a pernicious form of boredom. It's like uh instead of you know, it's like I don't know, I was going to say it's anti-boredom. It's not that either, but it's like it's that moment where you can be both be incredibly busy and extremely bored at the same time, right? It's like all this shit you've got to do, but it all kind of none of it really
Yeah,
means anything.
yeah, and I think well, it's interesting. You bring up an interesting like, is Wallace praising boredom in The
Mhm.
Pale King,
Mhm.
or is he not? I mean, I think there's that quote that you put on the core episode about how especially maybe today the pathway to bliss is to be as bored as possible,
Mhm.
and then the relief from that is the this immense gratitude at being alive.
Mhm.
He kind of gets into that, and it's not so much that he's saying, and I think some people could kind of miss the point of this, or um like it's not so much that he's saying like it's good that the world works that way,
Right, right.
works this way. He's not necessarily praising kind of the bureaucratic nonsense, even within the IRS and even within the tax system. But there's more of just this resigned sense of like this is the world we live in. And there's something heroic and great about looking at it without distracting yourself and
Mhm.
just owning it. I mean, we could obviously be critical of the degree of Kafka-esque. I do think that's a good operative word, and Kafka was
Mhm.
no small influence on Wallace, is my understanding.
Right.
He's not saying like, oh, it's good that we have all this bureaucratic paperwork about things. Um, Bracketing it aside with the tragedy within the novella and whether or not child, childbirth should be ruined by this kind of thing. I think specifically with regard to taxes, I think it's almost like a death and taxes joke somewhere within
Right.
there that
Right.
he's
Right.
saying
Oh,
Right.
for
like
sure. Oh, yeah.
this work does need to be done in some
Mhm.
capacity without having a certain political take on who should and shouldn't be taxed and why. It's more just a sense like there has to be some kind of I read the Pale King almost as like him saying, there's this collapse in a high trust society. There's he doesn't cite like Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone or anything, but like there's this general collapse in collective participation. But the one thing we're left with is taxes. And like I think and I mean, I actually think there's a harder reading of the book that's like a more dark satire, even that's like
Mhm.
actually, maybe it's really grim that that's one of the last like collective things that brings us all together as Americans is taxes. But I do think he's going for that. Like this is the thing, and people who work for the IRS are in some sense heroic for being willing to do one of the least popular and most boring jobs on Earth.
Right.
And that's basically because you asked me to sort of summarize the story, summarize the
Mhm.
novella. That's how it ends after all this happens with the father, and the protagonist just slowly comes. Uh, he's kind of getting more serious in general, but taking baby steps, and then he accidentally sits on this lecture about was it actuarial science? I don't even
I think
remember
it
what the
was
subject is.
advanced. I think it was advanced accounting.
Advanced accounting.
It was
Um,
this class for like it was like the last class you'd take before you took your CPA exam, I think.
Exactly. And he goes
Yeah.
into this review session by accident, and that's his road to Damascus moment.
Mhm.
He's like, this is it. Like these people are so serious about this incredibly boring thing that does, regardless of your take on taxes, the book's not political.
Right.
They're not really anyway. Like it
Not,
does
certainly
need to
not
be done.
political in like left versus right kind of. It's like yeah, it's not political in that manner. Yeah.
Yeah. And once he takes this class, it's like his a lot of us have had some version of this happen in our own lives, and you just suddenly realize what the path is, and you're willing to do anything. And it's that happens in the last like 10 or 20 pages of the novella, and then he
Yeah.
like stays up all night studying, goes to some IRS recruiting center, and the rest is history.
Yeah. Let
None
me
of what I've
oh
said does it
go ahead.
justice, though. I think it really like to read it. You are right, as with any good literature, you are right there with it. Just as in
Mhm.
Flannery O'Connor's short stories, you become a Catholic in the way that she is, regardless of whether you are or not at the moment of her character's conversion or their realization. Similar with something to do with pay attention. Now you are right there with
Yeah,
him, and it's yeah. I loved
absolutely.
it when I read it in high school, and I like it even more now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to read just a little bit because it's some of my favorite David Foster Wallace writing. And I may have actually read this on another dark room, so forgive me, but I think it's great. And this is the substitute who's teaching this class in which our main character has this road to Damascus moment. He's a substitute teacher, and I think it's a Jesuit school, if I'm not mistaken, or
Yeah, I
he's
was
a
actually.
Jesuit.
It's weirdly unclear. It's like the guy? He's a substitute. Like the guy's supposed to be a Jesuit, but he's maybe not. I mean, I didn't really
Right.
know what he was going for. I think it's DePaul. I think they actually named the school,
Oh,
which is a Jesuit school.
right, right.
And yeah, it feels like they're doing for a little bit of
Yeah, it's kind of like
citation of the Jesuit thing as part of the
right, kind of
spiritual
overlaying that
underpinning. Yeah,
there's like a religious significance to
yeah,
this.
I think that's
Yeah.
what it was. Yeah,
Yeah, and so there's this is the I'm going to just read you a little bit of the lecture that this substitute
yeah.
teacher is giving, and I guess it's a lecture. And one thing in the I'm going to skip some stuff because it's a long bit, but one thing that happens is the main character, he finds himself actually captivated for like maybe the first time in his life. And he notes this by saying he had stopped counting the words because this was like a habit that he had. He was always keeping track of how many words somebody said, including
Yeah.
himself. And it was a I mean, I think that the sort of metaphor, the analogical significance of that maybe comes across, but that's what he's usually keeping track of, not necessarily what a
Yeah,
person's saying.
just a typical David Foster Wallace-esque neuroticism of the
Right,
character.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But then we get this. So this guy, this substitute teacher is basically convincing the class that it's worthwhile to be an accountant because we all know an accountant is almost like a stand-in for like a crappy office job, right? Like
Mhm.
in fact, the Monty Python's Flying Circus, they would make that was like their joke was you're not gonna, the accountant was like the worst thing you could end up being, but not being like
It's so funny too, though, because you need accountants.
That's
You're
the point of
always
this.
going to need
Everyone does,
accountants.
yeah.
I need an accountant.
It's
Yes.
inescapable.
I
Yep.
love my accountant. I mean,
Mhm.
I've had this guy for a long, long time. Like I
Yeah.
have when I call him, I've called him in the past and when certain things have happened and asked for his advice. Like he's not anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's
Yep.
exactly the point that kind of the point that Dave Foster Wallace is making. Let me just read this bit because
Yeah.
and he's already done some talking, and this is sort of the last hurrah that really gets through to our main character talking about accounting. Quote, continuing on without pause, the substitute said, quote, exacting, prosaic, bonasic to the point of drudgery, sometimes, often tedious, perhaps, but brave, worthy, fitting, sweet, romantic, chivalric, heroic. When he paused, it wasn't just for effect, at least not totally. Gentlemen, he said, by which I mean, of course, latter adolescents who aspire to manhood. Gentlemen, here is a truth. Enduring tedium over real time in a confined space is what real courage is. Such endurance is, as it happens, the distillate of what is today in this world neither I nor you have made heroism. Heroism. He made a point of looking around, gauging people's reaction. Nobody laughed. A few looked puzzled. I remembered I was starting to have to go to the bathroom. In the classroom's fluorescent lights, he cast no shadow on any side. By which, he said, I mean true heroism. Not heroism as you might know it from films or the tales of childhood. You are now nearly at childhood's end. You are ready for the truth's weight, to bear it. The truth is that the heroism of your childhood entertainments was not true valor. It was theater. The grand gesture, the moment of chance, the mortal danger, the external foe, the climactic battle whose outcome resolves all designed to appear as heroic, to excite and gratify an audience. An audience, he made a gesture I can't describe. Gentlemen, welcome to the world of reality. There is no audience, no one to applaud, to admire, no one to see you. Do you understand? Here's the truth. Actual heroism receives no ovation, entertains no one. No one queues up to see it. No one is interested. He paused again and smiled in a way that was not one bit self-mocking. True heroism is you alone in a designated workspace. True heroism is minutes, hours, weeks, year upon year of the quiet, precise, judicious exercise of probity and care with no one there to see or cheer. This is the world. Just you and the job at your desk. You and the return, you and the cash flow data, you and the inventory protocol, you and the depreciation schedules, you and the numbers.
He's writing about writing. He's writing about writing novels.
That too.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
And I'm personally offended as a playwright.
Well, David Foster Wallace once said that something about writing a novel is basically the art form for the introverted exhibitionist,
Yeah.
which I think is pretty true, actually.
Yeah. That definitely resonates with me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'll never understand you people.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
So
no, go on.
go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I really like that section. Obviously, I mean, I could, to anticipate what would be people's, I guess, criticisms of Wallace is it, especially in this corner of things, it's like, oh, he's praising this, more banal. Not, I guess someone would be a little harsh if they say the bug man life.
Mhm,
Obviously he's describing something more authentic and real
mhm,
than that. Because I think specifically not to even use the slur or whatever, like people who talk about like bugmen and whatever, like
mhm.
they are talking about people who are sort of addicted to entertainment and people who live in the pod and eat crap
Right,
and watch. Obviously
right,
Wallace is having his own version of another version of not being that is what Wallace
right.
is talking about here. I can still imagine I hear the voice of more sort of masculinist type friends saying like, oh no, like we need to have real adventures in the spirit of the warrior.
Mhm,
I agree with all that to an extent, but I just think that that David Foster Wallace is describing is like another piece of the puzzle. I mean, I
mhm,
do think, traditional values, masculine values of heroism that we get from, even if it is theater, and even if some of it is kind of to inspire the imagination of the young and young at heart, like it still is valid. Like it's not. I'm not gonna. I don't know if David Foster Wallace was exactly saying this, and I certainly would not follow him fully into like this is it. This is what heroism is. Like it
mhm,
has to be working for the IRS. But I just think it's a matter worth considering.
mhm,
That the real issues of the day are have to be dealt with by cultivating, paying a deep kind of attention, and by being able to deal with boredom and tedium. I don't think these
mhm.
things are in contradiction with the more frog Twitter bodybuild messages. I just because I mean I like a lot of that stuff obviously, but that stuff too can become sort of masturbatory, as we all know from looking at people online. Kind of masturbatory and like people disappear into their own egos and
Mhm,
um I guess what I'm trying to say is while this gives us, I think, really good tools for navigating the world as it is, and
mhm,
even if we maybe would like to imagine a different alternative
mhm.
to this sort of weighed down by bureaucracy and banality world we have, like we still need to deal with it in honest terms. And I think Wallace can be really valuable for that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Kevin, you had something.
Well, I don't want to be too pointed about what precisely I do for work for my day job, but
Mhm,
needless to say, it's actually not that far removed from what you're describing here.
mhm,
It's in crypto, but it's just about as boring as it could possibly be, but it has to happen.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
I do interact with CPAs, and I do frankly admire what they do because it has to have it does it has to happen, otherwise people will
Mhm.
go to jail. I mean, like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
they'll put you in a cage if you mess around with the IRS. And I have my personal opinions about taxes. They're very, we don't have to get into it. Brad and I have yelled about taxes on this podcast before, but this is fascinating because I don't know this novel, but I feel like you've given a really compelling, or it's a novella.
Yeah.
Was this the unfinished one? Is this the one
Well,
that
Yeah.
was?
this fits like right almost into the middle of the Pale King. It's
I
a
see.
section of the Pale
Okay,
King, but it can
understood.
stand alone on itself. It doesn't, the
Exactly.
rest of the book doesn't
Fascinating.
depend on it. Yeah, yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
Fascinating. Okay.
And
Yeah.
it fits in with a larger theme that he has that's probably more filled out even in other chapters about what we might think of as very boring subjects of civics and
Yes.
responsibility and how to be a citizen, which are
Well,
generally not the themes of great literature, as we
well,
probably all know.
and
Yeah.
and I'm thinking about it's Pentecost, and we're thinking
Mhm,
about
Mm.
going to mass later today, dragging three very young children to mass later today, and like, and we're Catholics, and so there's a lot of theatrics, but it's a chore.
mhm.
Like
Yeah.
over the lifetime raising children in the church, it's going to be a chore. There's going to be a lot of driving. There's going to be a
Yeah,
lot
some
of
other thing we got
no,
to go to.
be a
Yeah.
lot of
Yes.
that. And that's what it is. And
Yeah.
but then that leads to moments of just complete ecstasy and communion and compassion, and all the other stuff of life follows
Mhm.
on the going,
Yeah.
which is
Absolutely. No, I think
right.
that's
Yeah.
part of what
Mhm.
David Foster Wallace is trying to say is like uh not only does it pay off to deal with chores and to deal with tedium and boredom, but it pays off precisely because it is boring.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? It's not just like, oh, it's worth it in the end. It's like precisely because you are doing it out of a sense of duty. That's how meaning is created.
Mhm.
Not to be too
Ugh.
Jordan
Well,
Peterson
well,
about it, but
yeah. Hey.
you need the sense of duty, and if you were, it was always just doing it because it feels good, it would not be as rewarding. Like what
Right.
creates the meaning is the fact that you do it regardless of how you feel.
Mhm.
I think
Clean
is one of
your
the things he's touched on.
spreadsheet,
Right.
bucko.
Right.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
I,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a copy of the Black Album in my Amazon cart right
Excellent.
now. I'm
Oh,
ready
And
to
thank you.
so should
pull.
all
I'm
of the
ready
Art of
to
Darkness listeners.
pull
Yeah.
the trigger on this. I'm gonna go in the break. I'm gonna go get my cards. I've got any number of cards with numbers on them that allow me to function in the
With
world.
with other people's
Uh,
names on them.
well, sometimes. I mean, I have multiple LLCs.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
then the third hidden LLC that we don't
Mm.
talk about.
Mhm.
Uh, and we are coming up on the break, but we will come back for the After Dark. Do y'all have anything planned for the
Yeah. I mean,
subscribers? Yeah, what do you got?
unfortunately, I'm a little maybe more amorphous than I kind of wanted to see where this goes, but I do have a little a bit from a 2003 David Foster Wallace interview that I kind of like to discuss because it feels sort of relevant to sort of political discourse that's going on
Yeah.
now, and I think we might get some sparks that come off of it or something insightful. And then also I kind of want to, one of the sort of things that David Foster Wallace is sort of at a cursory glance is kind of known for is this irony versus sincerity, or irony and sincerity, or maybe an axis of irony and sincerity. And as three writers, I thought maybe we could just almost shop talk a little bit about, like, does that mean anything to us as
Yeah.
writers? Like, do we feel ourselves playing in that ground at all? So yeah.
Yeah, I want
Sounds
to.
good.
Yeah, and let's talk about some other projects and stuff we have going on
Yeah.
in the After Dark for Patreon, for Substack. We've heard from people who don't like to use Patreon. You can use Substack now
Yeah.
and get the
Yeah,
exact same thing. They have total parity. It's
Yeah, we
they're the
got some
same
people. Some people are glomming onto that now, which is exciting to see. Yeah.
glomming onto the stack. That's very exciting. I also want to shout out, we went on Granite Mountain Movie Club and we
Hmm.
talked for 2 hours about Fargo. And that is linked from artofdarkpod.com. It's on YouTube. You're going to want
Mhm.
to check that out. Brad and I got to talk about one of our favorite movies. I
It's about
have
Fargo, so you know it's pretty
Oh,
good.
yeah. It's about Fargo, so it's pretty
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
You do
go
the accent
Bears.
so well.
Go Bears.
Uh-huh.
Well, I live here, dude. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
like,
yeah.
I mean, I'm not, I can only sustain it for a few minutes. I'm not a great actor, but yeah. Matthew, where can people find you before we break and then come
Uh,
back?
yeah, Twitter, at what even, MPEGZ 969 is who I am on Twitter. Let me make sure that's right. I don't know my own app.
I'll
Anyway,
link to
I
it.
think
I'll
that's
link
right.
to it in the show
yeah,
notes. I always link to things in the show notes,
Mhm.
artofdarkpod.com. Yeah. Mhm.
it's MPEG696, forgive me. And then Matt P969 is my uh name on Twitter. Matt, just if you Google Matthew Pegas, it's at this point, I'm the first thing that comes up.
And
So
of course, if you
yeah.
look on Amazon for the Black Album, your book is the first thing that shows up, I'm sure, right?
Yeah, no, just after Jay-Z, Metallica, Spinal Tap.
Yeah, you got some
Name it.
competition for the title, but that's
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little healthy competition. If you Google my name, the first thing that comes up is some star of a reality TV show about Alaskan fishermen who went to prison for domestic assault. So
Oh, wow.
that's cool. Yeah.
Lovely.
It's not me. It's not me, people.
Yeah.
Yeah.